In the last episode, I went over the chapter of Numbers 31 and the morality of Moses commanding the killing of Midianite women and children. And I disagreed with Moses giving that command, using God's commandment himself to show that. And the theme of that episode was focusing on the morality of military conduct while within the conflict of war, or as just war theory describes, as JUS ad bellum. But I want to shift now and take a look at why there was even a military strike on the Midianites in the first place. I want to analyze real quick the JUS ad bellum of the conflict. In Numbers 31, the reason why Moses was so upset with the Midians, or the Midianites, was because the women of Midian had seduced the men of Israel into sexual unions and worship practices that were apostate to Yahweh. And once Israel had fallen into these sins, a plague broke out that wiped out thousands of Israelites. Now, whether this plague was a result of biological warfare coming from the Midianites, or it was God directly punishing Israel for their sin, or both, it is clear that the women seducing Israel were acting on behalf of the Midianite and Moabite states. In Numbers 31, we learn that the women who were using their sexual wiles as a tactic against the nation of Israel, and Israel was falling for it. These Midianite women were spies. And spies that were surreptitiously using subversive tactics to weaken the nation of Israel as much as they possibly could in order for Midian and Moab to attack. In Numbers 31, verse 16, Moses says about these women, he says, "Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor." Now, those words Moses said, the words "on Balaam's advice," show that these women were on a mission to honeypot and subvert Israel enough to prepare the battlefield for Midian to attack. Because Balaam, when he says "on Balaam's advice," Balaam was a man who was employed by Midian and Moab as a military advisor to plan out the attack against Israel. In fact, when Moab and Midian first call Balaam to help them attack Israel, Midian and Moab had already made an alliance with each other to be against Israel's presence. In Numbers chapter 22, verse 3, it says, "And Moab was in great dread of the people because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel." Verse 4 says, "And Moab said to the elders of Midian, 'This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field.'" So once they'd made this alliance, elders from both Midian and Moab employed Balaam for the purpose of attacking Israel. But they couldn't attack Israel outright, because Israel was much more powerful than both Midian and Moab combined. So Midian and Moab had to bide their time until an opportunity arose to attack and destroy Israel. So they resorted to more clandestine, asymmetrical, and subversive tactics to wear down the Israelites in order to hasten this opportunity. That's why they employed Balaam in the first place, so he could use his divinations to curse Israel and make them weaker. And when that didn't work, Balaam went to other methods, including the one Moses spoke about, where Balaam advised the Midianite females. He advised Midian to send in female spies so as to subvert and seduce Israel into weakness. We know this was the plan the entire time, because when they employ Balaam, they tell him in verse 11 of Numbers 22, quote, "Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, and it covers the face of the earth. Now, come, curse them from me. Perhaps I shall be able to fight against them and drive them out." This verse in Numbers 22, verse 11, this verse reveals that the entire posture of Midian and Moab from the get-go was to set up the conditions as much as possible that could weaken Israel to a point where they could finally attack and destroy Israel. And they almost successfully did it. Numbers chapter 25 documents just how common the visiting of the Midianite women had become in Israel, and how Israel had made themselves yoked to these seductive spies. God says in verse 18 that the spies had harassed you with their wiles. All of this was going according to the plan of Midian. But throughout all of these events, there was not an outright battle occurring between Midian and Israel. It, in effect, was a cold war between these two people, and a cold war that was involved Midian constantly trying to use subversive, indirect measures to attack and weaken Israel for the sole purpose of giving themselves the upper hand in order to attack and destroy Israel. But with God's guidance, Israel decided to not wait around for this opportunity to come up, and ended up attacking Midian first as a retaliation against the Midianite espionage and as a preemptive strike against Midian before they could strike Israel. Again, I remind you that this preemptive strike was not unwarranted. Numbers 22 shows that Midian and Moab, from the beginning, had the intention to, quote, fight against them and drive them out. Do you know what that's called? That's called intelligence. It's called actionable intelligence. The type of intelligence about an enemy's intentions that justify a preemptive strike before they can have the upper hand against you. But even with this intelligence about Midian's intentions and subversive missions against Israel, the preemptive strike against Midian was never supposed to be a total destruction mission, as we've already established in our last episode, because God commanded Israel to spare the women and children in the strike. And besides, the Midianites themselves were not part of the 7 nations that God had directly said were dedicated for destruction. So, even with all these Cold War tactics that Midian was employing against Israel, God still saw mercy to be had for Midian in not destroying all of them in this justified preemptive strike. Now, I want to show another example of a famous atheist who attacks the Old Testament any chance he gets. It's one Samuel Harris. Now, Sam Harris has been an outspoken critic of the religion in particular, and the Bible in specific. And Sam Harris never loses an opportunity to attack the Old Testament on grounds that in military decisions of the nation of Israel, they include in their targeted military strikes the targets of women and children. Listen to him here in his debate with Dr. William Lane Craig.
Okay, and I want to suggest to you that it is not only tiresome when otherwise intelligent people speak this way, it is morally reprehensible. Okay, this kind of faith is the perfection of narcissism. I mean, God loves me, don't you know? He cured me of my eczema. He makes me feel so good while singing in church. And just when we had given up hope, he found a banker who was willing to reduce my mother's mortgage. Okay. Given all that this God of yours does not accomplish in the lives of others, given the misery that's being imposed on some helpless child at this instant, this kind of faith is obscene. Okay. To think in this way is to fail to reason honestly or to care sufficiently about the suffering of other human beings. And if God is good and loving and just and kind, and he wanted to guide us morally with a book, why give us a book that supports slavery? Why give us a book that admonishes us to kill people for imaginary crimes like witchcraft? Now, of course, there's a way of not taking these questions to heart. Okay, according to Dr. Craig's divine command theory, God is not bound by moral duties. God doesn't have to be good. Whatever he commands is good. So when he commands that the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites, that behavior becomes intrinsically good because he commanded it. Okay, well, here we're being offered, I'm glad he raised the issue of psychopathy, we're being offered a psychopathic and psychotic moral attitude. It's psychotic because this is completely delusional. There's no reason to believe that we live in a universe ruled by an invisible monster, Yahweh. But it is psychopathic because this is a total detachment from the well-being of human beings. This so easily rationalizes the slaughter of children. Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There is absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God. Okay, if they had the right God, what they were doing would be good on divine command theory.
Sam Harris uses the Amalekites as his example from the Bible of how the Bible is obscene because it teaches the killing of women and children. And that when people are delusional enough to believe in the Bible, that they would begin to start justifying the killing of women and children. Now, he mentioned the Amalekites, which is an event in the Bible that I will go into in later episodes, but I want to point out how the example of the Midianites that I'm going over right now and Israel's preemptive strike on them is exactly in line with a preemptive strike policy that Sam Harris himself advocates for. Except the only difference between Sam Harris and Israel's policy on preemptive strikes is that Sam Harris believes that killing women and children is justified in such a preemptive strike. Listen to him talk about this in his interview with David Rubin when talking about the possibility of Iran getting nuclear weapons.
There are a couple of passages in my first book, The End of Faith, where I talk about how a certainty about paradise and about martyrdom as the best way to get there just destroys the logic of nuclear deterrence, of mutually assured destruction that we had, that kept us more or less poised on the brink of a mutual annihilation with the Soviet Union for so many years. And I just pointed out what I think is an obvious fact, and still is an obvious fact, should be an obvious fact, and a very troubling one, that if you have a regime that has that is the psychological equivalent of the 19 hijackers, people who woke up in the morning wanting to fly a plane into a building. That is a regime who they're not rational actors. You can't, or if they're rational, they're rational within a context of believing that they're going to paradise this way, right? So
what's the rational part of that?
Yeah, but if you believe that, it's rational to blow up the world. It's rational to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour. So, this is not, so I pointed out the obvious fact that we have to avoid this circumstance at all costs, and there's no one who should be more cognizant of this problem than so-called moderate Muslims or secular Muslims or non-jihadist, Muslims. And we have to collectively find some path to a future in which you don't have a true jihadist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. And all of those, so long-range is crucial. I mean, so you have Pakistan. Pakistan already has nuclear weapons. Do I think we should execute a nuclear first strike on Pakistan? No. Pakistan is not, first of all, a jihadist regime, and though they're one coup away from being taken over by one, but they don't have the warheads that can deliver these nukes to the capitals of Europe or to the U.S. It's a very different circumstance. And so, yes, no, there's nothing that I say in that book that suggests that we should be nuking Iran, and so it's just, this is, all I was talking about is how the kind of game theoretic logic of nuclear deterrence that we lived, however precariously under with the Soviet Union, falls apart once you admit to yourself that it's possible that truly suicidal religious maniacs can get their hands on these weapons. And so all I was calling for is our awareness that that really is a game changer, and we have to avoid that at all costs.
Right, and you said this was just a few passages in your book. It was literally about a page, right?
It's like a paragraph or two, yeah.
Right. So when people have blown this up into something that somehow this is like this massive idea that you have. Actually, a good friend of mine who I agree with on a lot of things and disagree on some other things, what he says to me in relation to this is that you're laying the philosophical groundwork for a nuclear first strike.
Well, people respond to this passage as though I invented nuclear weapons, right?
Right.
Or that I think they're a good thing. Right?
Right.
I'm just talking about the reality of our world. We have a nuclear policy, right? We have a first strike policy. We have someone somewhere in a war room has beaten out every choice point in terms of what are the circumstances where we would use nuclear weapons first? Mm-hmm. What are the circumstances where we would imagine that they're going to be used against us first, and then have to preempt that? And this has all been thought out in a Cold War context. We haven't had to worry about anyone else doing this to us.
Sam Harris gets a little skittish when confronted with his own words about a preemptive nuclear strike on Iran, but he eventually stands fast on his position and claims that if the U.S. had good reason to believe that Iran would try to attack and destroy America, and Iran got the capability to do such a thing, and America had reliable intelligence of all of these things, and not just reliable intelligence, but reliable and actionable intelligence, then America should strike first and do so with nuclear weapons. Sam Harris tries to qualify his statements by saying that he doesn't necessarily think nuclear weapons are good, or that he wasn't the one who invented the policy of U.S. nuclear military strategy, but just that he's simply talking about the reality of our world, which is extremely ironic considering he expects people to let him get away with this when he himself never gives the same charity in his readings of the Old Testament. Does he not think that the Israelites weren't operating in the reality of their world? As I've already shown, Israel knew the intentions of Midian early on. They knew that the Midianites had the intention to fight against them and drive them out, as Numbers 22 says. Remember what that's called again? That's called actionable intelligence. And according to Sam Harris, Israel had every right to attack Midian, and not only attack Midian, but to kill all their women and children in a preemptive strike. Because when Sam Harris advocates for a preemptive nuclear strike against Iran on the basis of reliable, actionable intelligence, he's advocating for targeting an adversary in such a way so as to include women and children in the destructive attack. When Sam Harris does this, what he's doing here is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. It's all the more rich that he does this, considering that he touts himself as a moral philosopher. Now, I'm not disagreeing with Sam Harris about the principle of utilizing destructive means even as a preemptive military strike, which, to be honest with you, seems even to me to be too excessive at first blush. But what I'm pointing out here is the duplicitous nature of Sam Harris's approach to the Bible and his approach to military tactics. When he speaks out of one side of his mouth, criticizing the Bible because it includes in its military targets the women and children, but then out of the other side of his mouth, when he discusses military strategy for the U.S. against its enemies, in this example with Iran, he actually advocates for the inclusion of women and children in the U.S.'s targeting strategy. After all, he says the U.S. has to do this in order to prevent the enemy, quote, at all costs, from getting the upper hand on us and doing it first. Sam Harris is not ignorant at all about the destructive nature on non-combatants that a nuclear bomb would be. So, what Sam Harris is doing here is engaging in an activity that has a very specific and technical term. And that activity that Sam Harris is engaged in here is called hypocrisy. Now, Sam did mention the Amalekites in one of these clips, so we're going to move on past the Midianites for now to look at that story in the Bible, and we'll do that in our next episode.